Adobe After Effects has become the go-to industry standard when it comes to creating engaging and interesting animations. And if you want to become a proficient and talented animator, you'll need to understand and master keyframe animation. Some might say you need to be uber familiar with keyframes. Just remember that a keyframe records the current state of a parameter at that specific point in time in the timeline. The animation is created when there are at least two different keyframes applied to that one parameter. So let me show you what I'm talking about. In our project here, notice in the project panel, if I double-click our animation comp here, we have a composition that has several different layers. I'm just scrolling up and down on my mouse to scroll through the layers. Here we have the words of the logo broken out into pre-compositions. And we can just go ahead and turn those off for now because we're going to focus on animating these shapes here. So let's actually zoom in on the canvas. I'm going to scroll in on my scroll wheel up to about 200%, and then I'll press the space bar to toggle to my hand tool here and just kind of move over. And actually, no, let's go back to 100%. There we go. Make sure you position your canvas so you can see the shapes, but also on the left here, you can see the edge of the canvas because we want to animate this first circle to start from off screen and scroll right into its position. In order to start animating this, we should select this layer. I could do this by clicking in the canvas directly on the object or by going down to layer 4 and selecting it. When it comes to adding keyframes, you want to add them to specific parameters. If we open the disclosure triangle for layer 4, notice we have all of these different transform properties. Since I know I'm dealing specifically with position, I'm going to save some real estate here and just press the letter P on my keyboard. See, that way I can still see all these other layers. That way, if we wanted to animate these other layers, we could easily do that and not have to resize the interface. With this layer selected, I'm going to show you a little animation trick. Since all of the graphics are actually already in the position we want them to appear in, we're going to animate backwards. So move your current time indicator right here in your timeline on the right-hand side here. If I click and drag, let's move it to around 2 seconds. I know I'm at 2 seconds because it actually pops up over here on the left side of my timeline. To create the first keyframe, you want to press the stopwatch next to the position parameter. I want you to note the first time you press the stopwatch is pretty much the only time you want to press the stopwatch when it comes to setting your keyframes. And I'll explain why in a second. If we go ahead and click the stopwatch, notice we've added a keyframe. It appears here in the timeline. Now, since we already have a keyframe on this parameter, anytime you move your current time indicator anywhere else in the timeline, like let's say back to frame 0 here, if I change the position of this object by, let's say, going up to the comp and clicking on it and dragging, notice now automatically, no matter where I drag it, I'm getting a couple different things happening. First thing, you'll see these dots in this line. This is called my animation path. Let's drag it over here to the left-hand side. Second thing you'll notice, here's my keyframe in the timeline. Now I have 2 keyframes and therefore I have animation. Now to preview the animation, what you want to do is press 0 on your keypad. You notice my animation loaded up and my current time indicator is currently moving. I'm going to press the space bar to stop it. And I want to show you something. See, by default, whenever you load up a RAM preview, it's going to preview in your preview range. The preview range is currently set to 10 seconds, which is the length of this whole composition. So let's move our current time indicator down to around 3 seconds and press N. N is for the end of your playback range. Now, if I press 0 on my keypad, you'll notice, sure enough, it's going to preview only the first 3 seconds of the animation. Again, press the spacebar to stop playback. If you notice, I'm getting a slight little drift on this animation because I clicked and dragged and it's not exactly perfectly straight. And that was because I just visually started clicking and dragging. So what I'm going to do is delete this first keyframe. Now to delete keyframes, it's pretty straightforward. All you do is select the individual keyframe and press delete on your keyboard. Now you notice since there's only one keyframe, there's no animation. If I scrub in the timeline, you won't see any animation. Let me just Command-Z undo that last deleted keyframe. Another way to delete keyframes is to click on the stopwatch. But look what happens. If I click on the stopwatch, all the keyframes are deleted. Now, when you delete all the keyframes, wherever your current time indicator is at that point in time is where that object is going to stay. So let's just Command Z, undo that. And since I only want to delete the first keyframe, I'm just clicking off of both the keyframes so none of them are highlighted. I'm going to select the first keyframe and press delete. If I press home to move my playhead back to the beginning of the timeline, now instead of clicking and dragging directly on the object in the canvas, I'm going to click and drag on the x-axis parameter. So this is x, this is y. So now when it's all the way off the canvas, it's off screen and the animation will animate properly. Now there's one last thing I want to show you about this. It's these little dots here. Notice these dots are all evenly spaced. What these are telling me is the velocity at which this object is moving. This is spatial interpolation, which we'll get to in a little bit. But right now, I just wanted you to note that these little things are here and they're actually showing us something. This is going to move at a constant rate because this is 2 linear keyframes in the timeline. I'll get to what linear means and spatial interpolation, all that stuff in a little bit. But for now, let's preview this animation. Again, press 0 on your keyboard to preview the animation. And press the spacebar when you're finished. Now that you know how to add keyframes and delete keyframes, I'm just going to show you some other little quick commands you can use when you actually start having keyframes in your project. So the first one is navigation. If you want to move back and forth between keyframes, look on the left side of your timeline. See these arrows? If I click this left arrow here, see how it's slightly brighter than the one on the right? If I click on that, it's going to move my current time indicator up towards the beginning of the timeline. Now you notice I can't click anymore because there are no more keyframes. If I click to the right, now it's going to move to the next keyframe. You want to be careful when the current time indicator isn't on a keyframe, because if you click this button right here in the middle, it adds another keyframe based on what the current parameter setting is for that specific object. Since we didn't move anything, it's just the same as this previous keyframe. So I'll just go ahead and delete that. So for navigation, use the arrows in your timeline. You can also use keyboard shortcuts. K will move you down the timeline, and J moves you up the timeline. One last thing to understand is the Uber key. Remember, I said understanding animation is uber helpful? Well, basically that's because the Uber key, it's what I call it, starts with the letter U. And whenever you select any layer that has animation on it, if you press the U key, it will toggle the visibility of any parameter that has animation. Keyframe animation or otherwise, it's going to show you every parameter that's been animated for that specific layer that you have selected. I want to stress that keyframing is most definitely not the only way to make an object move around inside of After Effects. You can use other things like parenting or expressions, but those things are for another time. Right now, you should just focus on remembering where to look for keyframes in the timeline, and remember, understanding keyframes is uber helpful when trying to create animation.